Okay, thanks, everybody. It is 4:05. I would like to call the meeting to order. The Commission on Equitable Housing and Development meeting has now commenced. It is December 5th at 4:06 p.m. This is a virtual meeting. We ask that you, actually, it's a hybrid meeting. We ask that you mute yourselves until called upon to speak to avoid feedback and background noise. For those who have dialed in using the call-in number, to unmute to speak, dial *6 on your phone, and only use the chat function to request to speak. Also, to comply with the state open meeting law, attendance and votes will be done by way of roll call using audio. So I will do roll call at this time. Maggie Amato Reyes.
Present.
Wendy Asher.
Present.
Marianne Beerley.
Present.
Mindy Bernstein.
Present.
Mark Clark. I believe he's going to be late or absent. Vicky Cusina. I think same with her. Serena Warake. Lori Mazurbo.
Present.
Tisha Tallman.
Here.
Jim Topol. See Jim.
Present.
Ray Winch.
Present.
Kenny Wong. Present. And Jay Young, that is me. Ex officio members, Ann Chineka.
Here.
He's not here, I'm here for Klein.
Okay. Marcos Ismail. Here. And Mike Edmonds.
I am present.
All right. We have a quorum, and I would invite a motion to approve the November meeting minutes if there are no changes. If there are any changes, speak now. If not, I'll take a motion to approve.
I'll second it.
Do we have a first?
Motion to approve minutes.
Got a first?
I'll first do a second.
And then Maggie seconds the motion. So the November meeting minutes are approved. Let's go ahead and jump into the first item on the agenda, which is the call to the audience. The call to the audience is limited to 3 minutes per speaker and a total of 10 minutes. All speakers must share their name to be recorded in the meeting minutes. And please remember, the call to the audience may not result in discussion with members of the Commission on Equitable Housing and Development. No legal action may take place during the call to the audience, and speakers may not be disruptive. CEHD members may only respond to criticism and request that items be placed on a future agenda for discussion. And finally, members of the audience may still participate on agenda items as per the bylaws of CEHD. Is there anyone in the audience at this time who would like to speak? Going once, going twice. Anybody in the audience that would like to speak? Okay. Hearing none, we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is the presentation on the Safe and Vibrant City Sales Tax Initiative from Lane Mandel of the City of Tucson. Lane, are you on and ready to go?
I certainly am. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate being here, and I certainly appreciate all your work you do for the City of Tucson and for our community. So
Can we pause? I think we're having trouble hearing on this.
Let me get you to pause for a sec. We're having trouble hearing here at the at Primavera, so give us 2 seconds here.
Try to monitor, so.
Yeah.
There are captions there. What does someone take? We could maybe make the captions bigger.
Trying to get it some. Yeah.
The speaker right now is the real tech.
Yeah, should go to the owl. That one, right?
Yeah.
Owl. There's a meeting out to do video.
I should do both.
So it does both.
Should we try it?
It's a microphone.
Lane, would you speak so we can see if it's better here?
Absolutely. I'm Lane Mandel. I'm Chief of Staff to City Manager Tim Tamir. Can you hear me okay?
Take it away. Thank you.
Ah, fantastic. Wonderful. So I appreciate you having me here today, and I'm appreciative of all the work you do for our community. I think I have a PowerPoint. Cue the PowerPoint.
Oh, yeah, 1 second. If you have it up, Lane, you can feel free to share it too, but I can grab.
Oh, technology's not my strong suit. Okay, hold on.
Yeah, I can pull it up too.
Okay,
need it.
if you wouldn't mind pulling it up, Rachel, I trust your technical abilities far more than mine. I can go ahead and get us started. The city of Tucson has a proposition coming up for a March 11th election. So it's a special election. It's a new half-cent sales tax. Ah, beautiful. Thank you. You can go to that first slide, please.
Yeah, better now. Okay.
There we go. So it's a March 11th, 2025 ballot. The city, of course, runs its election as all mail elections. So the ballots will all come out in the mail. And the proposition encompasses a new half-cent sales tax that would raise the city's sales tax from the current 2.6% to 3.1%, which if you include the state's sales tax, that would mean the sales tax rate would raise from 8.6 to 9.1%. It would generate $80 million a year over the course of 10 years, which of course is $800 million. It would begin, if it should pass, July 1st of next year and then extend for the next 10 years. Next slide, please. And some of you may have seen this slide before, but the $80 million a year would be divided into 5 categories. And of course, $80 million is an approximation. With a sales tax, we may collect a little more or a little less every year. So it's an approximation. So we've broken this out by percentages because we don't know exactly how much we'll collect every year. And I'm going to delve into each of these sections and tell you a little bit more about them. Next slide, please. So we've created what we're calling a community investments plan, which details every line of spending for Proposition 414. And I'm going to go over the highlights here, but if you'd like to see the full community investments plan, it's at tucsonaz.gov/prop 414. It also tells you the approximate spending for each line within the categories as well. So our first bucket of spending would be first responders capital investments. So these are very similar, if anybody remembers Proposition 101 that we passed back in 2017, that's since expired. But these are many of the items that were contained within Prop 101. So we're talking about personal protective equipment for police and fire, apparatus, so fire engines, ambulances, and then patrol vehicles. For our police officers, that patrol vehicle is their office. It's where they spend their day all day. And we want them to have safe, reliable vehicles. We'd like to get all the Crown Vics out of our fleet and move them entirely into newer vehicles. We're using SUVs right now. And then facilities as well. So we would upgrade and modernize current facilities. And then we'd have two new police substations and 2 new fire stations that would respond to the growth that we're seeing on both the northwest side of town and the southeast side of town. Next slide. Our second bucket of investment would be under enhanced emergency response, and this is personnel. And this is the first time in the 12 years that I've worked for the city that we've included personnel in one of these propositions. It's a sales tax, so we can do that. With a bond, we've run some bonds before. A bond, you can only include capital items. You cannot include personnel in a bond. So the sales tax initiative gives us the flexibility to include some personnel, which we've done here. We've added firefighters and paramedics. We'd like to keep our ISO 1 insurance rating. We have the highest insurance rating possible here in the city of Tucson, thanks to the work at our Tucson Fire Department. We'd like to add in the people and apparatus to keep us at that high insurance rating level. Would be an additional 120 personnel, police personnel. And that would include approximately 40 sworn officers, 40 community service officers, so that's what we call our CSOs, and then 40 of our new private investigators that we're doing. We have a brand new program at police department, investigations. Normally what we think that the work that detectives do. We're now bringing in unsworn personnel, private sector personnel, to come in and work for our police department and start doing some of those investigations. So those are people who contribute to the work at our police department, but do not carry a gun and respond to emergency scenes. And then it also includes personnel for 911 and 311. And I don't know how familiar you all are with our 311 system. So it acts as a very traditional 311 system. So if you have a pothole that you'd like to report, you could call up and report that pothole. But it also works with our community safety, health, and wellness team to provide services and support to individuals who have non-emergency situations they need help with. So we're really looking to beef up that 311 area. Next slide, please. And I don't imagine I need to do too much explaining to this group about this next bucket. You may have already seen the items that are included under the affordable housing and shelter category. It's a quick summary of them here. So we're looking to get people housed and get unsheltered people into low barrier shelters. We're looking to get people housed, right, through our Housing First program. We're going to keep people housed. So we have resiliency programs for renters, homeowners, and we'll make our city-owned housing stock more resilient and then expand housing options through gap financing. And, we'll look to reduce impact fees. So these are all housing-related items in this bucket. Should I stop and ask if there's any questions related to this category? I'm sure Anne could hop in and help us out if you have some detailed questions related to this category. Okay, next slide.
How many more individuals are you projecting will be served?
Yeah.
Under this specific?
So there's a variety of items within this bucket. So it depends on if we're talking about something like low barrier shelters, and you can see I included the number on this one. But if you go to the website and dig in, you can see the numbers for each of these items. But $1 million a year is a significant increase to the amount of low barrier shelter beds. Also, our programs like Housing First are currently general fund funded, and this would fund that program. So it would impact each individual line item within this category in different ways. So I can't give you a number of how many people exactly it would impact, but we're talking about significant investment in these areas that we can't do currently with our general fund.
Thank you, Wayne, for the presentation. How did you guys decide how much to put into each of these subcategories? And are they fixed? Can they be adjusted if it passes?
That's a great question. I have a slide on accountability coming up, but we can go ahead and discuss it here because I think that's a really, really good question. So the percentage of dollars to each of the 5 categories cannot change without returning to voters. However, within each category, the spending is more flexible. And there'll be a Citizens Oversight Commission who I understand will have a direct relation to this group. And if there are recommendations that come forward, we have the flexibility built in to change the investment so that we have the greatest impact. That would need to be approved by mayor and council, but it does give us flexibility in a way that we haven't before. And do you want to talk about the relationship of the commissions?
Yeah, thanks, Wayne. Just a couple thoughts here, and part of why I did think it was helpful to have Lane, somebody from the city manager's office here, is to be able to help answer these questions. So thank you, commissioners, for I feel like this is an opportunity to better understand, and if there are questions, the manager's office is happy to answer. When it comes to the housing related items, happy to talk about this. And I think I brought this up 2 meetings ago because it was right before it went to mayor and council, that when you now go to the website that Lane had had just given the URL, and I'll put it in the chat as well. For this is the city's site. There is more information about all of these items on that website. And in it, when you go and you look at details under affordable housing and shelter, you'll see that 2 of the items specifically involve the Commission on Equitable Housing and Development. I'm all about not reinventing the wheel. You all are experts in this space. So one of those items is the gap financing pool. And so really hearing from you all about a need for a housing trust fund and a mechanism to fund the housing trust fund. So that's what this gap financing pool would do. And similar to home funding, which last year the commission was involved with hearing those presentations and helping to score those projects for recommendations. We're proposing to do the same with this bucket. So the Commission on Equitable Housing and Development would be involved with the annual application process to provide funding, and really similar to, and I believe Andrew Predis is going to give an update today on the PCHIP process. Next month will be this year's annual allocation. In the future, if this does pass, we would add this gap financing pool so that it's all one process. The second category within affordable housing and shelter that the commission would be asked to really help recommend and prioritize is the renters resiliency funding. So the idea there to help provide funding for existing affordable housing, rental housing projects. And so similar to the gap financing PCHIP process, would ask applicants to submit and the commission would be involved. So I'm happy to weigh in when it comes to the housing items, and also really appreciative for Elaine giving this presentation, since the housing is is one piece of the bigger puzzle.
Zan, appreciate that. Okay, I think we can go on to the next slide. Our 4th bucket is neighborhood and community resilience. And this bucket has the most disparate groupings in it. So I'd like to talk about this a little bit. The items in here are items that the mayor and council really feel like that if we invest in the community, we can create more resilient neighborhoods and community members. So we have things like early childhood education, and we wouldn't start our own education program. We'd probably end up partnering with Pima County's PEEPS program. I don't know if you all are familiar with their early education program there. So that would be more people that could come into that program. We'd invest in a youth workforce development. We'd also invest in adult workforce development. Violence intervention and prevention. We have a new VIVA program, formerly the Place Network Investigation Program. So we would invest in that program. It's been a huge success. It's seen over 70% reduction in violent crime in the areas we've been working in the first round, and we've just started the second round. That program, that VIVA program, is really an incredible example of how we've taken the approach to use public safety services to stop violence in areas. But then, of course, we know that doesn't solve that in the long run. So then we bring in our community enrichment coordinators, and they run leadership academies. They provide support and services in these areas that we're doing this violence prevention, and make these neighborhoods more resilient to the influence of crime in the future so that we can keep that crime from returning. And also provide support and care to the people who live in those areas. It's been incredibly successful. And so we'll look to continue to invest in that area. And then we have some beautification items in this bucket as well. Team Up to Clean Up, which is our program to really control litter in our community. And then Somos Uno, I don't know if anybody here has heard of that plan, but that's the city's new arts, history, heritage, and culture plan. We're almost finished with it. We're going to finish with it by the end of the year. And so there's money earmarked in this bucket to support investment in arts, history, heritage, and culture in our community. So to really celebrate the culture in our neighborhoods, and then also beautify our community, invest in the arts. We've seen through the city's UNESCO City of Gastronomy designation that even a small investment in the areas of arts, history, heritage, and culture have incredible economic development impacts for our community. So we're very excited to add that to this bucket as well. And then, of course, invigorate our economy through the investments in our Thrive programs, Thrive in the O5, and now we have Thrive down on 22nd Street. So there'd be money earmarked in this bucket for the Thrive programs as well. Next slide. Okay, and our last bucket is technology investments. So technology investments to the 911-311 communication center. I was at that 911 center on election day. We were very concerned about security on election day. And what we have down there now is what we're calling a CSARC, but it's actually just a tech center, a tech hub, where we can see activity all over our community through police body-worn cameras. We can stream those body-worn cameras right into the 911 center. The FBI joined us there. They said it was one of the best systems they've seen. We're running that as a pilot right now. We'd like to invest and make that a long-term investment in our center, technology investment in our center. We'd like to modernize police air support. So a good example of that is the fixed wing aircraft we'd like to invest in. We don't own one now, but we're having issues with illegal street racing, and we don't want to try and race those guys through the streets. And as a matter of fact, those individuals would love to be raced through the streets and have us chase them, but much better to have air support. And it'll also keep our officers in the field safer. And then public transparency, our body-worn cameras. We were one of the first cities in Arizona to go to body-worn cameras for each and every officer in our community. We paid for those cameras through Proposition 101. That money has since expired, and we also need to manage all that data. So that would be part of this investment as well. Next slide.
Question there. Can you talk some more about the modernization of the police air support and what that will cost and kind of what the transparency is on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to look up if that's annually, that's 1.6 million. Right now we own a couple of helicopters, no plane, and we have a small drone system. And so what they'd like to do is invest in one helicopter, bring in a fixed wing aircraft, and then modernize that drone system. Certainly we provide transparency on that. Transparency is really a top priority for all of our police initiatives. Data is a big problem for us, so we invest in some more data storage, but we think that we can provide better support to the officers in the field and provide a safer way to break up and track individuals doing things just like street racing, and have a better effect on that sort of crime in our community by using air support. So it is a relatively large investment, but we don't currently have a plane now. Okay, next slide. Accountability, I touched on this earlier. This is the 5th proposition that I've worked on. And for the last 4, each of them has had a Citizens Oversight Commission, and that's become very successful model for us to make sure that we have citizens in our community who are tracking the spending and making sure we're spending it exactly as we told our voters we would, and providing input on any sort of changes or we need to make in the program. So it'd be 11 individuals who are have expertise in their field. And then of course, there's the connection to your group that Anne spoke about earlier. All appointments will be made by the city manager. And again, like I said earlier, there will be no change to the spending within the 5 categories, but then within those categories, there will be flexibility so that we can adapt and change these programs as the needs in our community change. Next slide. Okay, so the questions I've been getting asked in the community is, how did we create this plan? This plan reflects the engagement and planning efforts we've been doing throughout the city. I got a sneak peek of a draft of the Plan Tucson, the city's general plan, this morning. It has 13,000 points of input and engagement at this point. And the 14 goals of that plan directly relate to the items we have here in Proposition 414. And of course, as you know, we have the HAS plan. I mentioned Somos Uno earlier. We have the Prosperity Initiative. We drew from all of these different plans and the engagement they've had with the community to create Proposition 414. Also, last year, during the creation of our budget, we had a budget survey and engagement where we had hundreds and hundreds of comments from the community, and we used those to get a better understanding of what people are concerned about and where they'd like to see us invest. I have been getting a lot of questions about why this combination of investments. Why housing items in conjunction with public safety items in conjunction with early childhood education. And the city of Tucson has in practice and in theory determines that there needs to be a combination of investment in our community in addition to the needs of the public safety departments so that we can be the most impactful on modern issues like opioid addiction, like unsheltered homelessness. We believe there needs to be a combination of these kinds of investments. I talked earlier about the VIVA program and how that doesn't work by just sending in cops. You have to send in cops, but then follow up and provide the care, support, and services that the community needs to be more resilient. We're looking to invest in the capital needs that we're hearing our public safety departments need with the resiliency that the community can build upon so that in the long term, we're hoping that we can decrease the need for public safety and provide more social services. Also, why is the city bringing this item forward? Why are we asking for a half-cent sales tax? Well, we're seeing a decline in state shared revenue. Our former governor, Governor Ducey, as a parting action, one of the things he did was implement a flat sales tax, tax at the state level, a 2.5% flat tax. And that's caused a decrease in revenue for the city. We're predicting a $40 million decrease in state shared revenue for the next fiscal year and $400 million in decreased revenue over the next 10 years. And the choice is yours. So the city believes that the best way to bring these initiatives to the community is to allow them to vote so that people can look at them and decide for themselves whether or not they feel that this is an area that they'd like to invest. Next slide. Okay, so here's where you can find resources for Proposition 414. There's the website that Ann dropped in the comments earlier. We have an email where we're answering questions. We're taking requests for Speakers Bureau. So if you know of a group that would like to see a presentation about the proposition, we'd be happy to come out. There's a direct phone number where people can call and ask questions and get resources. And we're available to talk to the community. We're super excited to take this out to the community. I know people have a little election fatigue after November, but we're very excited to bring this vision to the community and let people decide if it's something they feel is worthwhile for investment. I think that's my last slide. What else can I answer for folks?
Any more questions from the commissioners?
Yeah, thanks, Jay. Thanks for the presentation, Wayne. I was wondering how set those percentages are at the moment. It seems like if those, will need an adjustment for the future. Obviously, I'd like to see a lot more in housing and in improvements. Right.
Absolutely. So the percentages themselves across the 5 categories are set. They cannot be changed unless that goes back to the voters. So those would be set. However, the spending within each of the categories is more flexible, as I discussed earlier. Completely understand and not surprised that you would want to see more investment in the housing area. But the city is trying to present a combination of effective tools to help address the issues that we're seeing in our community. When I started with the city, one of my very first projects was Proposition 409, which at the time was $100 million for roads because we had a pothole problem, right? We had a road condition problem. That was relatively easy to solve, right? We sent out some pavement. The problems we're facing today are far more complex, far more complex. And so we believe it takes a combination of investment to address these issues that we're seeing right now. So absolutely, could there be more investment in housing? Always could be more investment in housing. But this is the funding we don't have for our general fund right now that we think will be impactful in our community.
So between now and when the ballot is for March, and those change in this period of time.
Oh, I'm sorry
Or-
if that was your question originally. I'm sorry if I misunderstood it. No, this is said, it's been approved by mayor and council. And so there won't be any changes between now and March 11th.
Mary Ann?
Oh, thank you for this. I was just wondering what kind of feedback you've gotten from the community so far from this?
Yeah, so we haven't done a ton of presenting on this yet. We were waiting for the November election to pass, and so we're just starting to roll out community engagement on this issue. But I will say I'm hearing a variety of things, and I think the hardest piece, to be honest with you, is explaining to the community that it's really the combination of investment that we think will be effective. We are looking for gaps in the system, right? We're not looking to be the health department. We're not looking to step in where the state operates. We're trying to find gaps and areas where we can fill those gaps and be more impactful in the community. I was honestly just the meeting before this speaking with our public defender, Mary Trejo, and she has 2 care coordinators on staff at her office now. And so these individuals go directly into the jail and connect people with housing so that they don't leave jail and immediately become homeless. And the more beds we have, she's super excited about Proposition 14. The more beds we have, the more her people can get people into housing immediately. So she sees this as a huge step forward in terms of justice equity, and she's really excited for it. So I'm hearing across the board, but I'm really trying to help people understand that with these combination of services, we think can be really impactful.
I've got Jim. Go ahead, Jim.
Lane, thank you for the presentation. I learned a few things, so I appreciate it. Isn't there another sales tax that's sunsetting right now, a 1/2 cent sales tax for streets or something that is also going to be on the same ballot?
So we had a 1/2 cent sales tax that was Proposition 101 that sunsetted in 2022, and we replaced it with what was then called Proposition 411, which is road work to repair every residential street in the city. And so we really replaced a sales tax with a sales tax. So there won't be, this is a brand new sales tax, and there won't be anything from the city with streets or related to roads. Now, RTA is a sales tax, and they're looking to re-up that with RTA next, which would replace RTA with RTA. And so that would kind of keep that constant. But my understanding is that won't be until a November 2025 ballot. And I don't see these things as competing at all. I think they're complementary when we're thinking about systems of transportation and housing. All these things are ways that we support vitality and support the individuals in our community. So I wouldn't see them as competing.
Okay, yeah. When I first heard about this, I was told that there was actually 2 sales tax propositions. One was the RTA sunsetting, and this is the new one. And so there was a concern about them competing with each other. Just as a point of feedback, at the SALC retreat 2 weeks ago, this was discussed in quite a bit of detail. And everybody in the group kind of was in tables, and they all gave their opinion on whether or not they thought SALC should support it or not. The general consensus by that organization was either neutral or negative. I was one of about 3 people that spoke in favor of it. So you guys have a steep hill to climb with the business community. They feel like the feedback that I got from SALC was they didn't feel like they were involved in the crafting of the proposition. Like they didn't have any input onto what percentage went into which category. And they're worried about the oversight. Those are the two biggest points of feedback that I heard. So they haven't come out with an official position as of yet, but that is, if I were you, that is something that I would try to jump on.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Jim. I've heard the same thing. I would certainly refute the idea that we don't know how to do oversight and accountability. We're really, really good at it at this point. This is the fifth proposition I've worked on. So we've passed 4 propositions, $1.2 billion. We spent every penny as we said it was going to. And I think we can see that our community is better for it. From parks to streets, to public safety, right? We've done a good job with that money. I'm disappointed to hear that, and I'm just going to speak frankly, since you were so kind to do the same. I'm disappointed to hear that they don't feel that they had input. I think there was a time in the city's history where certain populations felt that they had a direct line to give input, and we have in many ways democratized that input. So when we say we talk to, 13,000 individuals regarding Plan Tucson, our general plan, to see what's important to them, that feels like good feedback to us. That could feel very different to somebody who's expecting someone to come sit down at the table and take their input and see direct results of that conversation. So I think we're doing input and feedback a little differently these days than we used to. And I understand some people are not as comfortable with that.
If you could go back to the slide with the percentages.
Sure.
And I'm just thinking about where you talk about what can be moved, what can't be moved. Personally, I'm very uncomfortable with the idea of a bond to purchase a plane for more surveillance. Like, yes, maybe you talk about street racing. That also seems very right for squashing protests and civil movements and other ways of people participating in democracy. It's looking here of, okay, neighborhood resilience, affordable housing, like technology investments. Does that have to be all for police technology investments? Could that be in other technology investments? Or enhanced emergency response, like within those categories, are there opportunities to maybe shift less towards increased police and militarization and maybe other things that of technology investments that might improve the health and safety of our community?
Yeah, so just a couple of things. I want to mention that you'd mentioned it was bonds, and I just want to clarify that it is a sales tax package, and there's a big difference there for us in terms of what we can spend on. So it's a sales tax, not a bond package, and appreciate your concerns about the plane. I've certainly heard those as well, but I would like to say that TPD does not have a history of squashing protests using a plane or anything related to that. They are earmarked for public safety investment. It is interesting. Public safety is increasingly dependent on technology in ways that it wasn't before. And I can see how that would be viewed skeptically. I can completely understand that. And in a lot of ways, it's provided us transparency too. Proposition 101, when we went out for that in 2017, we had very few body-worn cameras. Now, because of that investment, every police officer has a body-worn camera. We feel like that's a big improvement in the way that our police force operates within the community, and in a way that's really positive. So it is earmarked for public safety investment, whether that be 311 or 911. We are increasingly using cameras more and more. Everybody is, and I can understand people's concerns with that. So, so it wouldn't be shifted to a different type of technology investment.
Maybe as a follow-up to that, and see Megan's hand is raised as well. You said 911 or 311. I guess I'm wondering about, like, if the commission right now, from why we're hearing this presentation and what kind of input might be helpful from us, is then a possibility of shift from the police to more money for community health and wellness?
And I would love that to be the case, right? If we're finding that 311 has become incredibly robust and a really important piece of technology to help assist community safety, health, and wellness, then absolutely the commission has the opportunity to make those recommendations to the mayor council, and the mayor council can vote on them. Absolutely.
Megan had his hand raised. I just want to let everyone know as well, we're about 25 minutes behind schedule, so I don't want to close down the conversation.
Is there with this presentation?
Yeah, is there an ask for regarding this presentation for the commission?
Not by me.
Is there an ask with this presentation, or is this an informational presentation?
No, and I'll jump in and say I've heard a few different questions from commission members, so really wanted to give this an opportunity to answer questions, but no specific ask.
Thank you, Anne.
I appreciate
Megan?
your time.
Megan, go ahead. You've got a question?
I'm sorry, that's me. You should be able to talk now, Megan.
Oh, thank you. Sorry about that. I put my question actually in the chat, but I was just curious, and I apologize if you did already speak to this, Lane, but you shared that, you know, the input has been received, and I was just curious if you can let us know sort of how prior input was made to create those percentages, the breakdowns, and if just a little bit more around what input did was utilized to create sort of the planning behind it.
Yeah, so during the creation of our last budget, our budget year runs from July 1 to June 30th. So earlier this year, we did budget engagement. We did a survey to the public. We had presentations to the public. We had an open email box, and we brought in our own employees to survey them on it as well. And so we had hundreds of points of feedback on where the public would like to see the city invest more. So we use that in combination with, we have several large scale planning efforts going on. So Plan Tucson, Somos Uno, Prosperity Initiative, a lot of the planning work that we're doing, we are getting a whole bunch of feedback and engagement, and we use that to guide us as well.
Ending is that this is voted, it's set, these percentages for this year.
So it's going to the election. They're going to March 11th.
Right. And then after a year, is there a possibility that the percentages can change?
No, the percentages won't change over the course of the 10 years unless it goes back out to voters.
I know it's a tremendous amount of work to figure out what's included in the package, so. I guess I'm hearing what Jim's shared and thinking about, you know, the visibility or what this kind of communicates. I kind of feel like it's going to be a hard sell to the public because of a lot of the investments aren't really public facing, projects. And if this is a sales tax being generated by people's economic activity, I love seeing the bus shelters there because that's, it feels directly related to what people are going to be using and what they're going to be seeing within their communities. But if we set the percentages now, I guess I'd ask to consider, to receive the public input about where those should be. Because if those are enshrined, I don't see how that will, I don't know, I guess I don't have a lot of confidence that it would pass, especially for what seems to be quite unequal. With things like technology, the tone that's set isn't, something like public broadband or, access to Wi-Fi that people are directly going to benefit.
April, I see your hand is raised.
Hello, thank you. I was wondering if it was publicly available or going to be made publicly available, the data points gathered through the July 1st to June 30th budget engagement via survey, presentations, email box. I've been engaging with city planning initiatives as a Tucsonan very recently and for a while, and I don't see reflected in these percentages what I have seen in terms of public engagement within the city. So I was kind of hoping to just be able to take a look at that information gathered specifically for this sales tax, if that can be made publicly available. Secondly, it was asked earlier, what kind of feedback from the community has been spoken on this matter? And going to a mayor and council meeting where they did approve these percentages, there was a very large community outcry against the percentages and the support of policing specifically. So I didn't want that to get lost in the conversation here. Thank you for allowing me to speak.
We can get you that information, April. The budget survey was done in the town halls in relation to the budget creation, but we can certainly get you that information.
Thank you. When can I expect that and in what way?
So it was presented to the mayor and council. There was a memo, so we can get you the memo, and I can get it to Rachel, who I'm sure knows how to contact everybody in this commission.
I will give Rachel my email. Thank you.
Thanks, April. Yeah, we have your email since you registered with this meeting, so I can pass this along to you.
Any other questions or comments before we move on to the next agenda item?
Thank you for your time.
I guess my last thought on it is, as we think about like an action moving forward, I'd love to either take a position on it, have something that we share with mayor and council. I'm wondering what the next appropriate step would be for that. If we have any recommendations.
And I'd like to add to that, to the extent that we do make any type of recommendation regarding this proposition, I would ask that it be limited to, or not limited to, but focused on the affordability portion. But knowing that, you know, 2/3 or, you know, more than 2/3 is devoted to other things.
It's definitely something we can put on another agenda or talk about in subcommittees as
Right,
well.
we have till March 11th.
We also have the time to talk about next steps at the end of the agenda. As well. Any other thoughts or comments before we move on? All right, thanks so much, Lane. Appreciate the presentation. Moving along, next on the agenda is a presentation by Bill Mackey of the Drachman Institute on Tucson's land use policies. This presentation was provided to the Equitable Housing Strategies Subcommittee, and we were very impacted by it and wanted to bring it to the full commission. And the report essentially investigates and recommends improvements to the city of Tucson's land use code. I believe mayor and council requested the research and report, and I will just leave it there, Bill, and let you take it from here.
Great, thanks. Everything can hear me okay?
Yep, you're good.
Greg Vitch is here as well, and he's with the Drachman Institute, and he'll be joining the presentation. Let me share my screen. Do you see the board that says the title board?
Yeah, we can.
So this was a report that we did last year, and it kind of I can't remember when it was finalized, sometime in October, I guess. But Ward 6 really started it, hired Drachman to do this work, and Ward 3 participated, as well as the Planning and Development Services Department with Corin, Dan, and Christina. And then Stephanie Barrett, who was a student at the university at the time, helped us out with it, and Greg and myself, and then Courtney, who's the director. We all participated in meetings and crafting the report. It started out as micro shelter, and we kept on calling it mini homes or something else, and Ward 6 was calling it something else. And so the first step in all of it was to kind of redefine everything and make sure we're using the proper terms. And micro shelter was specifically temporary shelters that could be built quickly for intermittent housing for homeless, as some sort of stair step to some other type of housing from homelessness. And there was a big demand by developers in town to create projects that were, 50 units or so of these micro shelters. Mini homes are really just tiny apartments, basically market rate housing developments that some developers are interested in doing. They're looking at modular housing. And again, that's, somewhere in a larger kind of scale of multifamily housing, not huge scale, but something, between 15 and 50, let's say. And then multifamily was generally just anything more than 2 units, as defined by the code. And as the report went on, it became more about multifamily than about micro shelters. One, because we discovered early on that there really is no course of action that people can do to speed up the process or ease the pain of doing a micro shelter development. And that the real kind of bulk of regulations is in the multifamily housing. And at the end of this report, House Bill 2721 came out, and it kind of blew everything that we did out of the water because of what the state is requesting the city to do. But nonetheless, a lot of this information in the report has been useful, not only for a new report on how to deal with this House bill, but also for the city to look at particular regulations that are used around the country that have been modified around the country to inspire more dense development. And so we did code review and we looked at the land use code. We looked at maps and we looked at actual sites. And so we tested actual properties and their dimensions and how the code affects them. And then we had interviews with 7 different developers that were trying to do micro shelter developments in town. And then finally, we did a comparison with Portland, Austin, Seattle, and Phoenix for micro shelters and multifamily housing. The first step is the regulations, and regulations affect time and land. And the first thing is time. And this graph, you don't need to make sense of it, but anything that's dark gray and doesn't have a little not item in it is by right. So a developer could do that, no problem, in whatever zone it's located. So these are all on the left are all the residential uses in Tucson that are within the land use code. And on the top are all the zones in which they could occur. As you see, single family detached is nice and gray pretty much throughout. But as you get down to these residential uses of adult care, physical and behavior care, rehab, or shelter, and even multifamily, you see that the things start to get either that there aren't as many gray spots or that the gray is a light gray, which means it has to go through a special exception process, or it has a little symbol in it, which further regulates what can happen within that particular zone with that particular use. And more or less what this found out was that for any of the micro shelters, they have to go through a special exception process or they can't be within a certain distance of a particular property. Marianne, do you have a question?
I was actually trying to make this sheet bigger so I could see the numbers at the top, and I think I figured it out. So thank you so much.
Well, thanks for bringing that up too, because the numbers at the top are important because they talk about the percent of land area that's available for these different kinds of zones. And as you can see, the percent of land area in the city of Tucson for R3 zone, which is our higher density zoning, is 2.6. But even furthermore, any R3 site that can have more than 4 units, it's only 0.96. And so on the multifamily scale level, what we're looking at is a situation where there isn't that much land available for it. And so then we went into the city, and these little boxes at the bottom are the areas that we looked at. So we looked at mostly Midtown and then this south section, south of along just east of I-19, and looked at how can we develop these properties, how many units can we get on these actual pieces of land. And for the R3, you can see that we have some areas where we get 7, but more than likely it's like 4. And the same with the R2 is about 2 units. And this doesn't include parking or garages or anything. It's just the unit count that fits on that size of land per the land use regulation, which is units per acre with the city of Tucson. And then furthermore, looking at these different kinds of zones that allow multifamily development, and in particular, we were looking for larger scaled lands that could accept either larger scale multifamily development or micro shelters of 15 or more units. And just looking at those zones, the number of units allowed, you can see that the percentage in the city is at like 0.1% for a majority of these areas. And so again, it's an uphill battle trying to find even land to do this on. So the code may say that we can have multifamily housing, but in reality, it doesn't really exist in the landscape at the level that single family housing does. And then with micro shelters specifically, this map shows your typical kind of 1 square mile in Tucson. And so this is your arterial street like Alvernon, and here's like Grant, let's say. These circles identify areas that the micro shelter actually couldn't exist. You can have a micro shelter development on a C1 property, but if it's within 500 feet of an R2 or higher zone, it's not allowed. You have to go through a special exception, let's say. And so all those would have to do that. And then there's a 3-acre minimum size within those, and you can see there's only a few of those within this 1 square mile. And then you can see the available R2 or 3 sites within the square mile. It goes down to 2. But then that would also include a requirement of the special exception. And then the other issue that becomes really pertinent when looking at this is the way that the land use code defines housing. And so the land use code defines the housing type, and then it defines kind of the number and type of people that live in those housing types. And then it regulates the use in the zone in which those things are allowed. And so there's this matrix of, the single family house with a family can exist just about anywhere. But a housing project with 5 unrelated people can only exist in certain locations. And you just wonder, like, with the new forms of the way people are living and the way people have to live, why we're making such specific definitions about who goes inside of a particular house or dwelling unit. One thing that a lot of people have been talking about recently is the whole SRO, or single room occupancy type of housing projects that existed in the early 20th century, and maybe they should come back. But if you wanted to do something like that in the city of Tucson, it would be very difficult. The other thing that this pointed out, which was kind of sad when I was first starting the research, was that the most vulnerable populations of houseless folk or juvenile delinquents or physically disabled or domestic violence victims is that they kind of need to ask for permission for housing to mayor and council. And that was just kind of a sad reality that I just don't understand the specificity of that in the land use code. And I think that's a longer conversation that the community needs to have. the basic, some of the basic regulations, like parking and unit count are seen in this graphic, where we kind of have regressed over time. In 1939, this development was built and it could have 8 units, one parking space per unit. This thing was built. I lived in it when I was a college student. It's totally legit and totally part of Rincon Heights neighborhood. If we took that piece of property and had to develop it today, we could only get 6 units and we'd have to have a full parking lot. And so there's just incredible ramifications for that, increase of heat island effect, a reduction in the task space, an increase in rent for the citizens because the supply goes down, and a decrease in overall income for our landowners. So it just seems like the land use code needs a little bit of a revision to go back and maybe look at some best practices that we had in the past. Marianne, do you have a question?
Could you send out that land use code that covers your recent comment about special needs, having to ask for permission basically to get housing?
Yeah, I mean,
After this is over, if you could just send it, that would be great.
I can send the whole report, to you guys. The document that we completed, not just this 5-10 page.
And that has that code in it?
Yeah.
Okay.
There should be in your other agendas.
Yeah,
also.
there's a link to
There's
it.
a link to it.
There's a link.
Okay, yeah, but online, if you look at the PDF.
And I'll look for the specific. I think Marianne, you're asking for specific code numbers, and I'll get that to you. And so at the end of the report, we kind of have these short-term and long-term considerations for the city of Tucson to take a look at. In the short term, dealing with micro shelters specifically was, like do emergency declaration. Just flat out say we need to do this and let's avoid going through the normal processes. You could also partner with religious organizations. And generally, not just with micro shelters, but also with multifamily housing, we could revise the land use code with the parking, and maybe make it more based on context than just like some random ratio. One of the things that the city did recently was they changed the parking regulations for multifamily housing up to 5 units, and maybe get rid of all commercial regulations for up to 10 units. Get rid of the commercial screening and landscaping, get rid of the setback requirements, and make multifamily housing up to a certain amount more of a residential scale kind of regulation. And then finally, a real simple one is round up the per unit per acre calculation. So like if you have an R2 unit property and it calcs out to like 2.6 units, you can only get 2 units on it. And there are other jurisdictions out there that round up at a certain number, and that would be a pretty easy fix to create more housing in the city. And then the long term are looking at the definitions for land for residential use. There's like the group dwelling situation is all over the place. I think Austin says 15, Phoenix says 12, Tucson says 5. And so, how many unrelated people can you have in a house is not a science, I don't think. I think it's just kind of based on whatever the community has looked at and feels comfortable with, and maybe it's time to start a new conversation to see what we're comfortable with. Look at, maybe some other industrial areas in town. I know the IID was created to kind of help inspire development in the downtown area where there's a lot of industrial zone properties, and maybe there's some other industrial zone properties within the central part of city that they've moved out and now they could be used as something else. A big thing would be revising the density calculations within the land use code. And so looking at floor area ratio instead of unit per acre. And so on a piece of property, it could be up to the developer to decide, how small of a unit can they go with. And really what gets determined with floor area ratio is the form of the building. Like how big is it on the site? How high does it go? And what are the setbacks? And so it's kind of a mixture between form-based code and what we have. But it has the potential to allow more housing units at a smaller square footage. And then finally, one of the interesting things that we saw that Greg's going to talk about, I think, a little bit is formalizing good neighbor agreements between developers, the city, the neighborhood, and the neighbors, and formalize that process as the projects go underway. And so specifically, those are the two things that Greg's going to touch on is the emergency declaration and then the good neighbor policy. Greg,
Right. Thanks, Bill. Okay, so to be clear, this part of the presentation is focusing on micro shelters, which was one subcomponent of the larger report. And when we speak about micro shelters, we're defining it as temporary housing solutions, oftentimes for homeless individuals or individuals that maybe are not in the traditional housing market. Oftentimes these are used as low barrier shelters, so housing first solutions. And these are usually thought about as temporary housing solutions. So this is not permanent supportive housing. So as Bill just talked about, some of the two things that we're going to focus on are emergency declarations and good neighbor agreements, the benefits they can provide to jurisdictions and the development of these types of communities. So we looked at a number of other jurisdictions and their sort of pathways towards these types of developments. And one such is Portland, Oregon. So in Portland, the mayor and council adopted a series of ordinances going back to 2015, dealing with housing. So those ordinances that created emergency housing declarations created an ability to provide temporary housing and temporary permits for shelters and shelter-related services. So there's two recent ordinances that are most important to this conversation in early 2021, late 2021. And those ordinances changed the zoning code to allow for outdoor villages by right. And as Bill just mentioned before, those are not allowed by right in our jurisdiction. It also identified city-owned properties that could potentially be used for those shelters. And then the second emergency declaration, it provided the regulatory tools needed to build those shelters. They started with 6, now I believe they're up to 9. And these are shelters where the city of Portland actually acts as the developer. They're not the operator, but they're the developer of the shelters. Next slide, please, Bill. So these shelters are known as safe rest villages. One, I think, important feature about these is that these were funded with ARPA funding. And so there's accountability and metrics that we can use to measure success. Other jurisdictions have experimented with this development type, but the transparency isn't necessarily as apparent because it's not required. But with the ARPA funding, we know how much money was spent. We know how many individuals were housed. We know how many individuals transitioned to permanent housing. We know the demographics of the individuals. So it's a pretty important, I think, case study. So these shelters provide a place to sleep, basic and necessary hygiene. They provide harm reduction. And most importantly, they provide case management and behavioral health services on site. And the goal of the program is for individuals to enter recovery, to then return home, reconnect with family, and in some cases, find permanent supportive housing. Next slide. So how the city identifies and cites these villages, for at least the first 6, and I would hope with all 9, it looked at high impact encampment zones, and it referred individuals within those zones to a shelter that was placed nearby. So this is not relocating people out of their community. I think it's a really important distinction there. In a high impact Encampments were defined as ones that had conspicuous drug use, paraphernalia, trash, proximity to schools, the size of the camp, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide, please. So each of these villages has sort of two very important agreements. It has a good neighbor agreement and it has community guidelines. So the community guidelines are a legal agreement that dictates what happens inside the village. And good neighbor agreements are legal agreements between the shelter operator, the city of Portland as the developer, and the neighborhood that the shelter is located in, about what happens outside of the village. And so there's, all of them are different, but in general, there is a 250-foot camping ban around the shelter. There's a required fence. There's required sort of ways in which drugs can or cannot be moved out of the facility. And the same thing happens with the community guidelines. These are guidelines that a shelter operator and shelter individuals agree to. And those are all, once again, they vary based, there's drug use. There's certain shelters that are more lenient, less lenient. There are certain shelters where certain individuals are allowed or not allowed, et cetera, et cetera. What I think caveat there is that oftentimes it's been found through our research that when these shelters are unsuccessful, it's oftentimes because those two, either the community guidelines within the villages or the agreements outside of the villages, are not enforced or they're not enforceable. And so our recommendation for the long-term success of these, if they are to be permitted by code, is that this is a very important subcomponent and it needs to be evaluated and they need to be enforced and enforceable. And in situations where we've seen that, we've seen great successes within those individual shelters. I believe that's all I have. Yeah.
That's it.
Thanks.
Great, thank you, Bill and Greg. One great presentation again. I just have a couple of comments, and the reason that we as the Equitable Housing Strategy Subcommittee wanted to bring this to the full commission. It just impacted us how much the idea that the zoning code really has the most negative impacts on our most vulnerable citizens. So, it's a real clear equity issue that I think is pertinent to this commission. And the other thing, we spent, I feel like, a lot of the first couple of years as a commission really drilling down and thinking about affordable housing. And, the fact that, there's almost nowhere to build multifamily housing within the city of Tucson just struck me as, a glaring need that if we want to have more affordable housing or just more housing in general, it's just very restricted in terms of the zoning. So those are the things that jumped out to me. I guess the question that I would have to Bill and Greg is, mayor and council, I think that received your report and you presented it to them and suggested a potential housing emergency and, obviously the things that we talked about. How was that received by mayor and council? And has there been any movement that you know of around any of these things that you presented?
The only thing that I heard from the mayor and council meeting where it was presented by Planning and Development Services was that some council members were interested in the emergency declaration. But I don't know where that's gone. And I honestly, what the state has done in terms of the House bills over the ADU and the 4-unit making any residential development within a certain area be able to have 4 units. I think that kind of like got stuff off the rails for a little bit. And so I'm not sure exactly. And that's really probably a better question to Corin, or I don't know if Ann knows, if there's been any traction with any of this.
Yeah, Any other questions or comments from the commissioners?
I have a comment. So I've done some research on emergency declarations and why cities do or don't do, and what sorts of buckets of money could potentially be released as a result of making the emergency declaration. And that's usually why it happens, is because then it can set into motion the availability of federal funds, whether it's for housing through HUD or, you know, through various other means, HHS perhaps, because of health crisis. And that's typically why municipalities usually make those declarations. But it would be interesting to know whether a declaration for temporary zoning variances would then result in some type of additional funding that the city would be eligible for. And I think that's something to be looked in by someone, I don't know whom, but maybe I'm just throwing it out there as a potential seed, that an emergency declaration can have a very positive impact on potential infusion of money into a municipality.
I guess can you clarify, are you saying do an emergency declaration because our zoning code is so bad?
No, I'm saying if, as you propose, an emergency declaration is made so that there can be these variances temporarily in the zoning code to allow for what you're suggesting, that maybe that would then result in us being eligible for some type of funding on the federal level, whether it's through HHS or HUD.
Jim?
Hey, Bill, it's good to see you again.
Hey.
Thanks for the presentation. Have you looked at the corridor zoning overlay, and do you have a sense on how much impact that's going to really have in individuals' abilities to get projects built?
That's a great question. I've just looked at the toolkit, and we have not analyzed its impact, but we are using some of the information in it for how we're looking at how to do more multifamily housing up to 4 units. And so they've done new categories that give, I guess, more lenient regulations on different types of housing. That's what we're looking at. I honestly, I don't know how much of an impact it's going to have for small scale development. I don't know. And what we're trying to do is, and also the corridors are, I mean, they're so fixed. And one of the things that all of these kinds of things that we're looking at is this going to create a lot of demolition? And is there even a community here that can afford to demolish and rebuild? You know, like there's so much stuff on the ground that I don't think is realistic while we make these, you know, overlays and things that are incentives and reduce regulations or open up the door for things. When you look at the ground, it's hard to see how it could even be implemented with the cost of construction, the price of rent, and all these other factors, and the land use, the land configurations, et cetera. And so that would be an interesting study and something we can talk to the city about.
Yeah. Well, I think everybody at the city understands that the zoning codes, the way they are right now, really do create a lot of problems in terms of being able to get projects out of the ground, because there's not very many sites, as you showed, which are properly zoned. And then even those which are, a lot of them have split zoning. And the way things are written right now is you have to meet the zoning code for each portion of the site that has multiple zoning on it.
Right.
So it just makes it really, really challenging to get anything done. And so I think, you know, the city was saying, okay, well, we're with the overlays that they did downtown and along 4th Avenue I think we're pretty successful in terms of stimulating a lot of projects through those areas. And I think they're hopeful that this overlay that's a larger kind of overall area that's going to allow multifamily by right is going to have the same type of impact, because in general, when developers look at a site, if it needs a rezone, they just move on and start looking for another site because it's too much brain damage to go through the process.
Right.
So, um, I think right now in our current market, I agree with you. Nothing's going to happen here right away because interest rates are too high and costs are too high. But at some point, that's gonna change. It might be 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. I don't know. At some point, the interest rates will probably come back down, and I think if they don't, costs are definitely going to come down because there's not going to be anything happening. So
I'm looking back on um, what I saw and sent to the city about the commercial corridor. I think it's gonna, it seems like it's gonna work. There's a couple like nuances that um, I think are weird, but other than that, if you, it's just, again, the one important thing that we did in this study was we looked at actual sites. And I think that needs to be done with just about everything. I think we had this discussion at the university the other day when Kenny um, was there and led this thing about, all the people that are working on housing there, that, planning has this, wide view and having it just kind of drape down over the city, whereas architects start at the site. And it was a really interesting discussion on the differences between that. And starting at the site, because I'm an architect, I'm going to say it's better because because it's what happens. It's where your pencil has to work and make it happen. And so I think testing is a really good suggestion. So we'll talk to Corin and see if that's been done.
yeah, the devil's always in the details.
Yeah.
We've got a question here and then.
Yeah, I'm Nick Martell. I'm with the Planning and Development Services, filling in for Corin Manning. I just wanted to touch on the community corridors tool that is going to Planning Commission study session here in the next couple weeks. It would allow for sites along corridors, major streets and routes within the city of Tucson to be developed. That's even the R1, R2, R3, O3, O2 zones that typically you can't get a lot of density. And it will be a tool that we're taking to mayor and council that would give you a lot more density, be able to do parking reductions through narrative, decrease some of the things that have gotten in the way with multifamily development in the city. To Bill's point, it's not a tool for small time development for smaller lots, and they are in fixed locations along major streets and routes and corridor areas. So if you have any questions about community corridor tools, I'm happy to share my email, phone number, and happy to talk to you and look at some site specific things like Bill was talking about.
Go ahead, Ray.
Let me ask you a question on that of what tools are being considered that would support more smaller scale things. I'm thinking of people, I know some folks who were formerly houseless were trying to get a plot of land and build homes themselves. And like, I personally live in a house that I built for less than $10,000. Like, I know that we can do those things. The building costs don't have to be that expensive, and they often are, going through some of the development process. And wondering, yeah, especially if we're thinking about declaring emergency housing, like what barriers can be reduced for nonprofits and for people who want to build a place in their backyard to help make housing more affordable.
Right now in the pipeline for City of Tucson, we're working on a lot of the state bills. So the ADU thing just passed. Missing middle housing for next year is on the docket, and that needs to be approved by 2026. That would allow 4 units on any lot within a mile of the central business district, which has not been defined yet. We're also doing the adaptive reuse bill that the state introduced, and that would give the city the chance to do up to 10% of all commercial buildings, convert them to multifamily residential buildings with a affordable housing component. So those are the three main things we're working on right now. There was just a planned area development authorized by mayor and council for some affordable housing in the Amphi neighborhood. And that one is authorized, it will be effectuated once it's built. And so those are a few things we're working on at the moment.
Thanks, Nick and Bill, for the presentation again. I was appreciated getting into that chart with all the gray bars. And yeah, I think you had mentioned for R3, that's less than 1% of land for 4+ units. And I was wondering, with the corridor tools, you know, is there an updated figure for what that is? I think it's probably a surprising number for a lot of people because Tucson's a big city. But the idea of like really dense development that's in a really capacity.
I don't want to speak for Bill's research on that, but we have done some research on how many, what zones are along the major corridors, and we can share that. I don't have that in front of me, but there are a considerable number of residential and office zones along corridors. We do have numbers for them.
Any other questions, comments before we move on?
I'm loving hearing about emergency declarations or zoning changes. And I'd like to talk about that more and how that can become reality. Not a question, it's more of a, do you want to dig into this?
I just want to thank them. Thank you so much for this work. It's very informative. It's very useful to a number of us sitting at this table. So thank you so much.
Well, I mean, we have to thank, you know, Ward 6.
Yeah.
For starting it, to be honest. I mean, they literally called Drockman and said, we wanna do something. So
I think it's
All right.
helpful. I'll plan on using the material and I would like to follow up on that code also. So thank you very much.
yep.
Right, thank you, Bill and Greg, for presenting again to the commission. And with that, we will move on to our next agenda item. If Keith and Andy are still around, because I know we're quite behind in our schedule, but we have a discussion on the ongoing efforts in Pima County and Tucson related to eviction prevention with presentations from Andy Flagg and Keith Bentley. I know Andy and or Keith had some time restrictions, so I don't know if one of you wants to go first based on that, but floor is yours.
Andy, I have no hard stop, so please go ahead if you need to.
Okay, I don't either, so but I'm happy to start, and I'm going to try to be very brief to leave plenty of time for Keith and also for any questions. I'm going to try to share my screen here. Can folks see this? How about now? Can y'all see this?
Yes.
No? Yes, okay. And this slideshow either is or will be available to the commissioners. So Chair Young and commissioners, thank you for having me. I'm here to talk about just a little overview of Pima County's Emergency Eviction Legal Services Program and to answer any questions about it. I have a little history here, an abbreviated history of how we got here. I'm not going to go through that except to say we started full operation in August of 2021, and we've been funded through American Rescue Plan Act funding for the most part. When we started this program, it was initially proposed as an eviction legal defense program, and we do that, and I'll explain how we do that. But we really wanted to, when we got in and started looking at where the needs were in the community, it really goes beyond just legal problems. Folks being evicted have a legal problem, but almost all of them have other problems and other assistance that they need. It's very rare to have an eviction case where it's just a legal problem and you solve the legal problem and everything's okay. I'm sure those are the cases the lawyers love, but there just aren't very many of them. So we decided to try to take a look at the eviction continuum and then look at what, with our resources and funding, what additional services we could provide. And I should say that our program is housed in the Pima County Community and Workforce Development Department, which is the county's primary non-health human services department. I say that that's important because it has allowed us to integrate a lot of these other services in there. So we see that there are needs for legal advice and potentially representation at various stages of the process, from the notice that the tenant gets at the beginning all the way up to the hearing. But if you're about to be evicted and thrown out by the constable, you probably don't really need or are going to benefit much from legal services, particularly not representation. And again, at all other stages, there are oftentimes additional needs. A lot of tenants need financial assistance. A lot of tenants need just to better understand the process, and you don't necessarily need a lawyer to provide that service. They need navigation to other services. They need assistance getting enrolled in benefits, getting transitioning to other housing, getting job assistance. That's a crucial component that I'll mention a little bit, and shelter, et cetera. So we've tried to say, we wish we could fix all the problems. We certainly can't do that, but we want to, everywhere we can offer an intervention, we try to do that. So if we look at, this is sort of what we're doing now, some of which is subject to funding availability that has sometimes been there and sometimes not. But from the notice phase to the writ of restitution phase, we provide access to some level of navigation and resource navigation and access at the end part to a social worker. We think that's important because understanding the process empowers people, and also because folks have needs that lawyers can't meet. So we provide access to court navigators, and then on the back end, we absorbed an existing function that was part of the constable's office, which is the constable social worker, whose job is to respond to requests from constables for assistance with vulnerable families who are about to be evicted. We provide brief legal assistance to any tenant who's eligible. Eligibility is very simple. It's 80% area median income and some level of eviction risk, and you can't be past your judgment. We don't offer legal services past judgment, but if you are at the notice phase, the filing phase, or you're about to go into court, assuming that we can logistically accomplish it, we get you brief legal assistance. Tenants for whom there is an appropriate legal defense to raise are provided representation. That decision is made by the lawyer they're referred to. It's not made by us. It's not made by the tenant. And we have an additional payment tier we offer to lawyers for when they provide full representation. We also have provided expedited rental assistance when there's funding available, referrals to job assistance. Those are incorporated directly within our department because we are the one stop and offer job assistance, job training, job development services. And so we can directly intake clients into those services. This just a note on how we get the word out to people, and I think most of you probably are aware of how to get in touch with us, but you're certainly free to get the word out as much as you can about our services. But we partner with the Justice Court, and we get a list every day of every case that's been set for hearing, and we send a postcard to that tenant every day. We've done about 38,000 of them since we started. Big shout out to the Pima County Print Shop, which essentially does all of this for us. All we do is give them a list. They do a mail merge, create a postcard, and mail them out every day. Legal services are offered through a roster of lawyers. I know that Wendy Asher is a member of the commission, and Sal is a partner along with others who provide brief legal assistance and, if appropriate, full representation. Expedited rental assistance is processed in-house currently. While we have a small amount of funding available, the ongoing nature of that funding is a real major question mark, as I'm sure all of you know, whether there will be some source determined for ongoing rental assistance is very much up in the air. Our constable navigator works with vulnerable families about to be evicted. We have our Craycroft shelter. I won't get into that too much, but that is a partnership with the city of Tucson that is focused on housing or on sheltering vulnerable individuals and families who are made homeless specifically due to eviction. And we have a pipeline directly through our constables to intake folks who meet eligibility into that shelter. And again, direct referrals to job assistance. I'm not going to go too much into detail on the Craycroft shelter. What I'll say is that we have on-site case management and wraparound services that we're providing to folks. That is, I think, really critical to the success rates that we've had in terms of exits to positive destinations. Money, as I said, for the most part, we've been funded by pandemic relief funds. The EELS program, the core EELS services, court navigation, legal services, constable, social worker, et cetera, runs about $1 million annually. And that has been paid through American Rescue Plan Act. And then the Craycroft shelter is another 1.3 million a year, which does not include housing assistance, and none of this includes rental assistance either. That's additional funding, which we're thrilled if we can get it. And we are funded, EELS is funded through this fiscal year, June 30 of 2025, and there will be a request in, well, we have a grant application out, but we also will have a request in our budget proposal for next fiscal year to continue EELS, and then the Craycroft is funded largely through the Arizona Department of Housing through June 30 of 2026. Just some numbers, I want to highlight because I'm talking to a city commission. 80% of our clients are residents of the city of Tucson. That's been pretty consistent throughout the course of our program. We are a Pima County program, but we are serving the whole community, and much of it is residing in the city of Tucson. 50% of represented tenants receive a favorable result. Now that's a subset of everybody we refer to legal counsel. We think that's a good model. We think that shows that we're taking the right cases to full representation, and that we're not spending money on full representation that could be going to other services for essentially representation that will not accomplish a successful result. So the 50% rate has held pretty steady throughout the course of the program. And then some numbers here with respect to additional resources and services that folks have been provided. And just last here is a graphic, and my thanks to Keith for his number crunching that he does as part of his work with Zero. Justice Court eviction numbers are the orange line in Pima County, have remained relatively steady since 2020, beginning of 2022. I use that date because I feel like when we sorted out all the pandemic moratorium stuff and we got essentially back to what I think is the new normal. I do it at the quarter level because we do see jumps from week to week and month to month, but this smooths it out a little bit, and it shows the long-term trend, I think, a little bit better. Maricopa County numbers are at the top. If you read the news, they've broken eviction filing records over the last couple of years. So we think the picture here in Pima County is better, certainly not as I would like it to be. I'd like to see things dropping. I'd like to see things, I'd like to see it at zero. But we think the picture has been better in Pima County, and through a lot of the efforts of this community, have been able to accomplish that. So that's a real abbreviated version of my presentation. My contact information is here, and like I said, you either all have or will have access to the slides. I'm happy to answer any questions. I can defer to the end of Keith's presentation to do that if that works best, or whatever works for the commission. But I thank you all for your time.
Keith, why don't you go ahead and go with your presentation, and we'll do questions at the end.
Sounds good. How's that look?
Good.
All right. Thank you, Andy. I will also try to be very quick in concerned about time. So Allison Miller asked me to come present to you all, Chair Young and Commissioners. I appreciate your time to speak to you about this recently implemented Prevention and Rapid Resolution Program that TPCH implemented. This was using funds from the Garcia Family Foundation, which also is funding this evaluation. So very quickly, just to give you some high-level details on the program, there was 593 total applications in a period from May to August of 2024. 277 of those applications were funded, so that's 47% of the total applications. Very quickly, very shortly into the program, TPCH realized that because they were having very light eligibility criteria, the money was going out very fast. So they implemented a weekly cap on funds. So after Monday or Tuesday every week, the fund was running out for the week, and then applications would keep coming in. So one of the unintended effects of this was that we have a control group of people who are very similar to the other folks, but did not receive the funding. So that's going to be some of the contrasts I'll show you in a moment. So 380 unique individuals applied. Some people applied over and over. Most folks applied once. One person applied 9 times. And most of these folks were housed at the time of application, but this fund was also available for people experiencing homelessness who needed specific things paid for to help them enter housing. So moving costs and things like that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. The demographics are pretty representative of people who are experiencing housing insecurity in Pima County. More women than men applied. About half of folks who applied had a disability. About 1 in 5 had a children in the house. And then 45% of applicants were single and 55% were 2 or more folks in the household. So total, the program distributed $487,000 in this 4-month period. The average payment was about $1,900. The median payment was about $1,500. And payments were as small as $83 and all the way as large as almost $8,000. But most of them, the majority of payments were below $2,000, as you can see in the histogram here. Okay, so let's get to the most important piece here, the main outcomes. So what we're looking at here, I just want to be really careful. So we're looking at the proportion of housed applicants, but I want to stress that about half of these folks were renters or homeowners, but the other half of folks were in some kind of subsidized situation. So they were either in a subsidized rental with a voucher, in a housing program, or in a very housing insecure situation like they're doubled up or couch surfing. So with that in mind, I also want to be crystal clear. HUD has a specific definition of what it means to return to homelessness. That is not the definition we're using here. What we did is we went back into HMIS and we tried to identify if people came back to a TPCH provider looking for services after receiving the funds. So because most people received the funds between May and August, and we did this lookup in December, this is sort of like 3 to 6 months past when people received funding. So are they showing up looking for services again or not? Okay, so with that in mind, the punchline here is that of funded applicants, only 7% of them did we see returning to the system. And of those who were unfunded, we saw 15% of those folks returning to the system. So there will be much more sophisticated analyses to do with this. I was working on this at 6 o'clock in the morning because this data is very freshly cleaned. But big picture, what this is suggesting is that roughly a 50% reduction in returns to looking for homelessness services between the funded and unfunded households. Very quickly, breaking apart those folks who are in like traditional market housing versus those in subsidized units or in housing programs. Across these two groups, we see very similar, roughly 50% reductions in the rate of entry into homelessness, which we're defining as returning to looking for services for homelessness here. So I'll hold for questions, but I just want to very quickly, I'm working on the 2024 gaps analysis for TPCH, and I just want, which will come out later in December, but I just want to highlight the main punchline of this because I think it's very important. Need for services. So this is captured, I think, in a very useful way by applications for housing services through coordinated entry, which is how you access all of the TPCH programs, all federal funds that are for homeless services. We've had a really dramatic increase in the number of unique households seeking services every year, with like a real record high here in 2023. This need to service ratio over the same time period, we did not have an exponential increase in our shelter beds, in our permanent supportive housing units, right? All those things are largely flat over time. And our system already has been overburdened by like an 8-to-1 ratio of people seeking services. But I just want to give you a sense of the system flow is very slow, and you're adding a lot of inflow onto a very slow system. So let's just stick with these nearly 8,000 people who are seeking services in 2023. About 1,600 of those stayed in a shelter at some point, and only about 1,000 of those households were referred to a provider for a program, for a housing program. Of those 1,000 people, the providers were only able to find and enroll about 500 of those households over this entire fiscal year. So I just want to stress that our system is overburdened in terms of rehousing people and serving people experiencing homelessness. And with these inflow rates, that is honestly getting dramatically worse. And so we're seeing our by name list, which is the number of people who are seeking services, who are actively in contact with a provider. And so this is not everybody. A lot of people don't stay in active touch and they fall off of this list. But we're having record high levels that have been increasing steadily over the last calendar year of people on this list who are saying, I'm here, I'm waiting for services, and waiting for a provider to get back to them. I just want to stress that for the last 2 years, we've had record low unemployment. Rental rates have been flat. They increased dramatically, but they've been flat for the last couple of years. Home prices have also been flat for the last couple of years. My point there is just to say, nothing is getting better in terms of the structural drivers of entry into homelessness. Evictions have remained elevated, slightly down this year, but generally a pretty flat line we were just looking at. If that's the case, when we, again, in the context of record low unemployment, I think we have a dramatic urgency for increasing our homelessness prevention efforts, because we cannot get the system to work better if it's continuing to be so overburdened. And I would just say that the business cycle is what it is, and we are going to have a recession at some point. And having a recession on top of such incredibly high levels of housing insecurity and housing cost burden is a really frightening prospect to me, because I'm very concerned about massive increased inflow on top of a super overburdened system. And the last thing I'll say is that due to the election, I am very skeptical that Congress or the state legislature are going to help us on a substantive enough manner, fast enough to get ahead of this. And so I want to apologize to all the county and city people here. I am going to be running around for the next few months with my hair on fire, talking about how our only levers of control are our local prevention infrastructure. I think we need to focus hard on that now and expand that as much as humanly possible, honestly, to give us a chance at getting ahead of this. So I hope that doesn't sound dark. I also just want to say, those of you who know me for years, I try not to run around with my hair on fire unless it's absolutely real. And I just want to tell you, I'm really in another moment of feeling very urgent about this. So I agree with the calls for emergency declarations, and I also generally just want to refocus people's attention urgently to the need to increase our prevention capacity. Sorry to go on for so long. I'll stop. Happy to answer any questions.
Yeah. Thank you, Andy, and thank you, Keith. I just wanted to, I hate to throw more fuel onto the fire, but Keith is looking at HMIS and PIT counts. And there are people outside of the continuum of care. And we know that we're undercounting. So, even if we were to look at all of the housing providers within the area and how many people they service, the numbers that are presented in HMIS and the PIT count are dramatically underrepresented. Because we know how many people that we are serving every year. And we know how many people are in the housing provider space who are providing an astronomical amount of folks too. So I want to thank you again, Keith, Andy. Keith, your work is always useful, helpful, and it moves the needle, helps us move the needle on providing more services. But I think this reiterates the emergency and the urgency around providing housing and services for Tucsonans.
I would just like to add, you know, I think the thing that jumps out to me is if you put resources towards this problem, as you can see with the EELS program, you get results. It's not rocket science. It's complex, but it's not rocket science. You know, we need more resources, and with more resources, we know what to do. I mean, would it solve everything all at once? Absolutely not, but to think that we don't know what we need to do, I think is foolish. So really is about resources, at least for me. How we get those resources, who knows, but anyway, any other thoughts or comments?
So I would agree, Jay, you know, it is not necessarily rocket science. There is an absolute shortage of affordable and decent housing, but part of the issue is keeping the people who are housed, so they don't become unhoused, they don't continue to be vulnerable to losing their housing. And a lot of that falls to short-term rental assistance, which nobody seems to get. Nope, the funds aren't available. People don't know how to access the limited funds that are there. It's not clear, at least our clients, it's not clear when they come to us if they're gonna be able to get assistance. They're calling all over. They don't know what the criteria are. So a lot of public information is missing in that. And I think one of the ways to prevent people from being evicted is to keep them from being evicted the first time. Because one of the most significant factors towards people facing eviction is that they were previously evicted, either because they don't know what to do to address housing issues, they don't know where to get resources, or they don't know how to manage their relationship with their landlord. And we know there's some really crappy landlords out there. But what makes people really vulnerable for eviction is they've been evicted before. And doesn't take a lot of research to look at what the overall impacts are for individual households as well as for our community overall on what the impact is of repeated evictions on people's mental health, on their ability to keep their kids in school, on their ability to keep jobs. All of those things, they all sort of cascade into a nightmare. We see folks who've been evicted multiple times, and what keeps somebody from getting housing the next time? They have a history of being evicted. So all of this is all tied together. I can't thank Andy enough for the funds that come from EELS that help us at SALA provide representation. Arizona is one of those states that does not have right to counsel in house and eviction cases. What we see, because we now have funds to go to those cases, are a couple of things. One, a represented client has a better outcome. Even if they don't have a great defense, they have a better outcome because they have somebody helping them negotiate some kind of compromise. Additional time is sometimes all people need. It also gives us an opportunity to be in court on a regular basis to see some of the procedural errors that are going on, where the landlord bar gets away with all kinds of crap.
Before we do more questions and comments, I just want to do a time check. We are coming up on 6 o'clock. I think it's worthwhile to continue with our comments here. But I'm just kind of thinking out loud here about how we handle this, to be respectful of people's time. I know, Ray, you had time on the agenda. We still don't have the HCD update, the Pima County Housing Commission update, subcommittee updates, and next steps. I would propose that we finish up this discussion and kind of wrap up, unless there are a couple of things that really, I know, Tisha, you had something out of your subcommittee. But what do y'all think we should do in terms of wrapping up the meeting, considering we've still got some things that we need to talk about?
And this was, my comment was gonna go to that point. I don't think, because we're an open meeting and we're 4 to 6, I think we need to end at 6. And everything that's on the agenda, I would propose that we just move to the next agenda. One thing I do want to state that was going to come out of our subcommittee on housing first, and I think it's appropriate given this discussion, is that the next item, I request that we bring Rachel Milne from the city of Phoenix to speak before the commission. It's our recommendation that the commission hear what she has to say specifically in regards to sanctioned encampments. So I'd like to put that on the agenda for next time, because I think it falls in line with here. I also recommend that we put back on the agenda item the sales tax incentive, because I think we need some discussion on potential recommendations. And then, that sales tax incentive presentation juxtaposition against what we're hearing here, I think there needs to be a good discussion on 17% devoted to affordable housing and 2/3 devoted to public safety. Yeah.
That sounds good to me. So why don't we just kind of wrap up the discussion we're having here and, see if there's any like last parting words and, wrap up for today. Kenny, I think you had a.
Yeah, just completely agree. Thanks, Tisha and for Keith and Andy. You're just really struck by the small amount of funding that made an impact for so many households. As we're thinking about the sales tax initiative and resourcing these programs. I just thought that was, in the grand scheme of things, not very much, but very impactful.
Any more comments or questions on this agenda item before we move to wrap things up? Okay, thank you, Andy and Keith. Those were very, very informative presentations, obviously. A great impact for us. Thank you for your time. From here, I want to make sure if there's anything. I know HCD didn't get to update, Ray didn't get to speak as well. We didn't really have subcommittee updates. Is there any burning issue or anything that needs to be discussed or mentioned before we move towards wrapping up?
Jay, sorry, I'm trying to, I just wanted to make a couple announcements that are relevant before next month. I'll be super quick. One is P-CHIP applications for the funding sources, emergency solutions grant funding, community development block grant funding, and general fund. Those applications close December 20th. So just want to make sure all nonprofits understand that deadline. Home funding applications close December 22nd. As you're fleshing out your agenda for next month, please keep in mind we do need to have the presentations for the applicants. So we're estimating that would take about 40 minutes. So just want to make sure that's on your radar. And then last, it's January 29th, but right now TPCH is putting out the call for volunteers for the pit count. So those are the items that I know are urgent on our end.
So just to wrap up, for the next steps, we do have the presentations that Ann mentioned for the next meeting. We will also, I think, be able to work with the facilitators from Southwest Decision Resources. So I think we need a significant amount of time to integrate them in and kind of figure out how we're working with them. So, just right there, that's, probably pushing an hour and a half. So we're already probably going to have a pretty full meeting. Ray obviously didn't get a chance to speak this time. So just be thinking about that as we're thinking about our next meeting and then the following meeting, really, because it seems like we've got kind of an overflow of things. And then the upcoming subcommittee meetings are on the agenda. Equitable Housing Strategies, Tuesday, December 17th at 1, Housing First, Tuesday, December 31st at 4, and Affordable Housing, Wednesday, January 15th. Any last minute comments before we wrap up and adjourn? All right, thanks everybody. Really appreciate the presentations and thanks for all the conversation.
Thanks, guys. Good job, Jay.
Bye, y'all. Good to see you.